Hello and welcome to this special edition of the 2025 Boyer Lectures, a rare chance to hear all 5 of this year's lecturers in conversation. I'm Julia Baird. Now, the topic of this year's Boyer series is Australia, a radical experiment in democracy. These lecturers have original and divergent perspectives on what makes our democracy unique and strong, and where our vulnerabilities lie in a world of rising autocracies, artificial intelligence, misinformation, climate change, shifting alliances, foreign interference, and a chronic decline in trust. So how do we best protect the democratic experiment that has worked so well for this country to date? So let me introduce them. We have John Anderson, farmer, grazier, former Deputy Prime Minister and former leader of the National Party. Welcome. Amelia Lester, writer and editor, now Deputy Editor at Foreign Policy. Justin Wolfers, Economist and Public Policy Professor at the University of Michigan and Visiting Professor at University of New South Wales. And we have Distinguished Professor Larissa Berendt at URLI, Gamilaroi woman, who's a scholar from the John Bunner Institute at UTS. Good to see you. And Professor James Curran, historian at the University of Sydney. Welcome to all of you. It's just so great to have all of you together now, because now Justin Wolfers' opening lecture made the argument for the robustness of our democratic institutions, which he says has brought us prosperity and which makes Australia, as he put it, freaking amazing. But our other lecturers have a somewhat different take, which I'd like to take the chance to explore, and I'm going to start with you, John Anderson. Now, in recent years, I've been quite fascinated to see you discover this kind of quite substantial online audience. As a YouTuber, you have like more than 750,000 subscribers. Now, your belief is that while these institutions have been historically strong, that the spirit of democracy in this country is weak. Can you explain why?
Thank you, Julia. And can I say I agree with Justin entirely that the institutions that we have been blessed with are extraordinarily durable. They are incredibly high quality. We ought to be deeply thankful for them, and we ought to understand what they are and who gave them to us. If you like, the machinery of our democracy is still evidently in reasonable shape. The Economist would say we have the 11th most functional, I suppose you could put it that way, democracy of some 167 countries around the world. But the spirit of our democracy, harder to measure, is, I suspect, not so healthy. If I can take a couple of commentators from the country you're spending a lot of time in, David Brooks from the New York Times, columnist there, he observes that we don't have to worry so much about the people who are trying to tear down democracy, and we see plenty of them around the world today. We need to ask, who is building it up? Who's cultivating the garden? To take somebody from the other side of the political spectrum, Thomas Sowell from the Hoover Institute, he warns that democracy must be cultivated. That means that you've got to understand it, you've got to actually figure out what makes it work, what makes it tick, and that if you lose that understanding, you will ultimately lose democracy itself. He says we're not paying the rent, and sooner or later the landlord will turn up. Now, we come to Australia. I agree with you on the institutions. The government's own understanding of democracy survey shows that less than 50% of us have had a civic education. Do we understand our institutions? Do we understand the giants who formulated the Constitution, dry and dusty document it is, that served us so well? Do we understand the undergirding philosophies of a fair go that we pride ourselves on, that every citizen has worth and dignity, as you said? Or in this age, have we descended to tribalism, where if you dare to disagree with me, you're an evil person and I'll clobber the living daylights out of you? That is not how our institutions were designed to work and to treat us. We are living, you made the very valid point, so did you, Julia, that trust is integral to a working democracy. 2/3 of us do not trust most of our legislators most of the time now in this country. That's how bad it's got. The ANU's been tracking confidence in the federal government since, I think, 1971. The chart is depressingly headed in one direction only. It was a major blip in 1996 when a certain government came to power, and we did a few things that actually made us help handle the GFC better than other countries. I think you'd agree. There was another major blip, but it fell away. I can't work out why. Then there was another major blip in 2007, the Rudd election, and it fell away even more quickly, but the overall trajectory is terrible. Low trust societies are not societies that continue to prosper.
What do we do about that, John? Restoring trust?
I think debate is all important. We need to learn how to disagree more often, not less, but to do it in a more civil and decent way where we recommit to respecting one another. And the old adage attributed to Voltaire, but he didn't actually say it, that I may disagree with you, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. We've got to do that. But I would say the most important thing we need to do of all is to rediscover something that our forefathers understood, which was that regardless of our differences, every Australian individual has worth and dignity and has a standing. That's something we've lost with the desertion of Christian faith, I think. It's been massively weakened, but it lies at the core of a cooperative democracy where we trust one another and we can find enough common ground to move ahead rather than compete with one another.
Amelia, do you think we can have confidence in our institutions? So you have been thinking about artificial intelligence for this lecture series and how we seem to be too complacent about it. We're not approaching it with significant urgency. Do you believe we can have confidence that we can withstand some of the pressures that other democracies are folding to?
One thing I am concerned about is that the rules of the road on artificial intelligence are being written not by Australians and not even by the American government, but by unelected tech executives in Silicon Valley who have a profit incentive and want to chalk up all the good things about artificial intelligence and want to avert our eyes from the potential risks or downsides of it. One thing I think, riffing off what Justin was talking about the strength of our institutions, is that we have a model right now where we are, in Australia, passive tech takers. We take technology that is given to us, mostly by American companies, and then we implement it in the ways that they want us to implement it. This is basically modelled on this neoliberal idea that the markets are going to work things out for us. The very fact that we've just had to implement a social media ban in this country shows that we had to put all sorts of band-aids on the internet and on social media when it came to Australia. And it's harder to put band-aids on something than set up the rules of the road at the time of implementation. So I'm wondering whether our institutions can move out of an existing pattern, which Justin was talking about, which has worked very well in many ways, but embrace a more active role in shaping the technology that we use.
And what would that look like when it comes to artificial intelligence?
Well, I think it's really hard to talk about artificial intelligence, right? Because when you think about it, it's funny that ChatGPT really broke onto the public scene 2 years ago, which is kind of crazy to think about because it's all we talk about these days, seemingly. And of course, artificial intelligence as a technology has been around since the late 40s, but I'm talking about the large language models that have broken through into the headlines. And so it's really hard to pass the difference between what is hype coming from the tech executives and what it's actually going to look like in implementation. But one area in which we can see that it's already changing the way that we live is in the workplace. McKinsey estimates that in the next 20 years, half of all jobs are going to be automated. And one top line from researchers such as Daron Acemoglu is that what that's going to do to the workforce is increase inequality. It's going to tip the scales in favour of capital over wage labour. In fact, some people in Silicon Valley want to do that. They want to get rid of the idea of salaried labour or wage labour altogether. Now, for a country like Australia that really prides itself on the values of equality and you might call it mateship, what are we going to do when half of the workforce no longer has a job? We already have a tax system that's incredibly hostile to salaried workers and which is friendly to wealth. So that's another area in which we're going to have to look at reform. Maybe reforms like universal basic income, radical ideas.
Am I seeing you twitching slightly there, Justin? Did you want to jump in?
a meta comment first, and then I'll come back. If you're only talking about what might go wrong, you've only got half the story. So let's come back to what might go right. Work's boring. I don't really like it. I'd rather not turn up. And if a computer can do it for me and I can go down to the beach and have a swim, that's glorious.
Where's your money come from, mate? Who's going to pay you?
No. So the computer does the work. So let's come back, because the problem here is not a technology problem, right? So here's an experiment, Julia.
Yep.
For your birthday,
Yeah.
I'm going to give you a robot, and it can do your work for you.
But I want it to do my washing,
Yeah, it'll do that.
you know, and clean the house and get away from my writing.
It'll do all that. It'll do whatever you want. How do you feel about this birthday present I just gave you?
Yeah, I've got a few questions.
I reckon
But
pretty
generally, sure.
Go for a swim, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Domestic
right.
labour to vanish would be great.
The same robot exists, but this time I'm going to go to your boss at the ABC.
Oh, well,
I'm going to go to Kim.
there we go.
I'm going to say, Kim, I've just invented the Julia Bot 5000. It can do everything Julia Baird does. It's going to cost you nothing. Jules, how do you feel right now?
I think there should be a bigger price on that, my friend.
You're out of a job.
Yeah, well, correct, yes.
You're broke. Right. The same technology, this is the point, the same technology, one way is utopian. The other way is dystopian. It's not a technology problem. What we have is an ownership problem. If you own the Julia Bot 5000, you're freed. If Kim does, you're screwed. So it's not a problem of the technology. This is something we can think through. This is Amelia's point. Let's get active.
Amelia.
I think that's a great point, and part of what I want people to take away from my lecture is we are currently treating AI as an inevitability, and in terms of its implementation, we are believing whatever we are being told by the people who own the large AI models. And what I want people to take away is that the AI is meant to work for us, not the other way around.
Now, James, can I go to you, because I'm interested in this idea that we're kind of fleshing out here, which is that Australians have a lot of faith in some of our institutions, particularly, say, the Electoral Commission, but we don't have we've got declining faith in the people that are running the institutions. I mean, if we pull out a couple of stats, which I know you love, is, you know, only 1 in 2 Australians think democracy is on the right track. Half of us think corruption is widespread in Australia. 80% of Australians think political leaders abuse their powers at least some of the time, and only 30% of us trust government officials. What's going on there?
Well, I think Justin, in his lecture, rattled off quite rightly a series of seismic reforms that really transformed this country over the course of the 20th century. One of the big problems, though, in terms of our institutions is that whilst they might still be robust, the question is about the political class that's leading them, right? They are not leading. They have lost the art of persuasion. Those reforms were brought in with advocacy and argument, and I'm struggling to think now of the last time that I heard a national leader really convincing on this front. Instead, we are beset, I think, with chronic ad hocery, short-termism, the quick political fix. You know, take for example, I mean, the absolutely appalling advocacy from the Prime Minister for the Voice referendum last year. And then by Christmas, so we were told it would make us all feel better as Australians. By Christmas Day, he was saying, in a sort of an interview that went largely unnoticed in the Australian, well, look, it doesn't matter to me because I'm not Indigenous. That is the failure of the referendum. Now he's just given up on the Republic. I know the Republic is not a pressing issue, and it is. I've told both my daughters it's up to them to achieve that in their adult life. It's not a pressing issue. But on some of the things that are, you know, jobless households, inequality, access to housing, I see more homeless in the streets than I've seen in my adult life. Prosperity, productivity in this country is buggered. Yet where is the political leadership? Where's the argument? Where is the story to make sense of these tectonic forces that are moving beneath the surface of contemporary events? Where's the political leader that's got the courage to come out and give us a story about where the country's headed? We've got a great story about its past, I agree, albeit with, you know, a lot of blemishes and a lot of parts where we've fallen down. But, you know, we did used to have political leaders who were prepared to go out and employ the art of persuasion. They're not doing it, they've lost it. And that's a big problem.
I want to come back to the question of leadership, but first, Larissa, you identify as the measurement of a successful democracy is how the most vulnerable people are treated. You also identify kind of racism within the Constitution, how it allowed for racial discrimination at its very inception, which is a structural problem, remains today. Now, James brings up the referendum. It is 2 years to the day today of the Voice referendum. Given that a majority of Australians said no to that proposal, where does that leave us now?
Well, I agree with Justin about how robust and strong our institutions are, and that we should be very proud of them. But I also think that one of the things we should be doing in terms of reflecting on how strong and robust our democracy is asking that question of the extent to which it caters for everyone. I really liked what Justin said about how inclusive societies are happier societies. I think that's a really great point for us to sort of focus on. And I can look at the history of my own people, of Aboriginal people, and our exclusion from the Constitution, from public life, and over time that has been amended through effort through civil society, but not through fixing the Constitution. I argue in my lecture that the framers of the Constitution set it up to reflect their values at the time, and that included the ability to make racially discriminatory laws. So
for migration purposes.
For migration purposes, the White Australia policy, of course, was a primary driver for that. So it's not just Aboriginal people from that inception, but over time as a society, through a strong sort of civil, through strong civil values and debate, we've become more inclusive. So I think it's an important practice that we should have to think about those things. And I guess the thing that concerns me, and I think we're in many ways in agreement about the fact that there's a poverty of ideas, there's a poverty of debate, there's a poverty of trust. And that what concerns me about that in terms of what's been healthy and good about our democracy is places where we do learn to argue, where we do learn to think, where we do learn to reflect, are actually places that aren't held in as high esteem as they used to be. Universities should be seen as a public good, and they've been enormously underfunded. Research isn't treated as important as it should be. Humanities and social sciences, those places where we learn to think, we learn to hear what other people say, we learn to argue, we engage in the Socratic method, we think about what it means to be human, they're also under attack, as are the arts, as are our cultural institutions. So I think that one of the things that we should be really looking at is how do we create those spaces where we can have those respectful debates, where we can have those exchange of ideas. And I think as we face these new series of challenges, increasing housing affordability, the challenges that will come around AI, we need to also be looking at how those parts of our society where we exchange ideas respectfully are protected as part of a very important part of that democracy where we exchange ideas and reflect on inclusivity, and we can reflect on how great and unique Australian institutions are, but I think we should always be questioning about how are they meeting challenges and how can we improve them.
I mean, I know this is a question that you thought about a lot during your time in politics and also since leaving politics, John Anderson, is the nature of leadership and the problems with leadership in the country, which were identified by James. So do you want to respond to that? What can be done to give us a bolder, sharper political class that is more interested in persuasion, inclusion, and character, as you have so often said?
Just a little question. I would proffer that the last time we had a full-throated debate in Australia about economic reform was 1998 and a new tax system. That's astonishing, and it reflects very poorly on us. So I think we're agreed. The institutions we've been bequeathed are capable of taking us forward, including when we face difficulties and failings, but they require both those who lead and those who follow to respect them and work with them and to believe in them, to understand them and believe in them. But we've fractured so badly as a society. We've never been as distrustful, as atomised, as divided, and as focused on our differences relative to the things we have in common. And this is very dangerous, frankly, at a time when there are plenty of external forces in the world who mean us ill. You talk about AI, there are certain people who are a lot more threatening to me than the tech people in America, if they happen to win this race. And think of the military applications and so forth that we may face. These are huge issues. Obviously, everyone's crying out for leadership. All I can say is that the thing that encourages me from the podcasts that I do is the way in which I think the sharpest of the thinkers in Generation Z may very well turn out to be the next greatest generation, to use that American expression. I think they're absolutely outstanding, and we ought to stop exasperating them. And we ought to get real about that other issue that you've just touched on, Amelia, housing affordability, because we've now got a situation in Australia. This is a country that used to give convicts 30 acres of land when they'd done their time. This is a country where home ownership meant that you were invested in the country. It's collapsing, and 60% of young Australians now no longer believe they'll own a home unless they inherit. Stop and think about the dynamics, economic and social, of that. So we are desperately looking for leadership, clear, fact-based arguments, calm, reason, and authenticity and trustworthiness. And without it, I'm sorry to say this, but despite the quality of our institutions, I'm going to say to you, it is my view that we are now entering a period of structural decline as a nation, and we won't be able to turn it round.
Can I just add to what John is saying? Yeah, that is the big thing that worries me over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, actually. I mean, there is this great assumption that the Australian centre will hold, and it has held when it's been put under strain, particularly over crises related to immigration and multiculturalism through the 80s and 90s. Those were met very strongly, and the centre held. Now, the centre is hanging by the skin of its teeth in a lot of Europe, in the UK and the US. It's the big challenge, I think, now for Albanese not to be so complacent. You know, there is something endearing about Australia's lackadaisical, she'll be okay, lucky country, mythology that we like to tell ourselves. But he's got to work a lot harder. Making the Labor Party the natural party of government does not necessarily correlate to the sort of challenges that he needs to face up to over the next, 5 or 6 years. Where I would have a sense of optimism, I suppose, is that, clearly, as we've been talking about, the nation state, as it were, is having problems responding to these kinds of really generational challenges that are pulling at its cohesion. The nation state is struggling. Now, nations do have a way of reconfiguring themselves for changing circumstances. And in fact, the rise of modern nationalism in the mid to late 19th century was an example of that. The question is there enough residual glue? Is there enough of an argument for what's holding the nation together now to make sure that, things hold? And I think there's a flashing amber light. I mean, we're already seeing some political figures in this country starting to sort of, put the match to the sort of smouldering resentment that is clearly in some parts of the community about immigration, assuming that the populist and nativist train will arrive from America and Britain. Now, I hope it doesn't. I hope things hold. But that's a bad sign that there is a view that that's the way to start stoking resentment and division. So, as I said, a flashing amber light for the Prime Minister.
Well, without better leadership, that is precisely what is coming our way.
Why don't we have better leadership, John?
In my earlier answer, I think it's partly because we've actually decried it. We've actually mocked the idea of public service for a long time. We've taught our children in the classroom that you're the centre of your world, if not of the universe. It's all about you. Whereas once we talked about community, once we talked about neighbour, once we talked about service, those sorts of things matter. And here's one of the great ironies as a former politician, dare I use that word. We hate our own value system when we see it on display. We look at them and say, you're behaving as though you think it's all about you. It's meant to be about me and about us. But what are we instilling in our children?
Amelia, I'm interested in your take on this and how we're talking about leadership. One of the things that has come through strongly in your argument is about complacency. And we're talking about complacency here in about conversations we're not having and that we urgently need to be having with the US alliance, with AI. What do you make of these statements about our leadership?
Yeah, I've been struck by how just about everyone on this panel has talked about trust as a key bedrock of why Australian democracy has worked so well and what is threatening it. And I hate to bring AI back into it, but AI is going to make the trust problem worse. And I want to explain, unless we think about how to properly implement AI models. And I want to mention that on two levels. The first is the level of trust in artificial intelligence as a ubiquitous technology. There's been a fallacious argument put forward by people who have a lot of money to make in this industry, saying that the guardrails need to be taken off so that the US in particular can innovate and get ahead of China in what has become a geopolitical competition for who will control AI in the future. That argument doesn't hold water. Consumers are not going to use artificial intelligence unless they trust it. And the way that they will come to trust it is through guardrails, is through believing that the people who make these technologies have actually thought through the risks and the downsides of them. So that's the first trust element with AI. The second trust element is information is key to what we're talking about here. You mentioned the importance of fact-based arguments, and I couldn't agree more. But right now, experts warn us that people can create AI propaganda factories from their bedroom using cheap, downloadable models to create very persuasive frameworks that will flood social media platforms. So we cannot ignore the risk that AI poses in these two areas to do with trust. And that is why we have to have the guardrails conversation right now. Getting back to the complacency point, I wanted to ask Justin a question, if that's okay. I was struck in your presentation, Justin, that, Australia sounds like a great place. The problem is that 12 months ago, the United States seemed like a great place. The Economist 10 months ago said that the United States economy was the crown jewel of the world. And now I don't think it is. So how can we avoid that same fate in Australia?
Yeah, wow, big question. I was just sort of struck. Everyone's so miserable. Where's the optimism?
Mate, you're wearing that hat.
Yeah. Do they have antidepressants in Australia?
I think, if I just may, just for a moment, I think everyone is saying something very positive here, which is that the institutions that have been bestowed upon us are of world-class quality. We've just got to use them properly.
Yep. And so I want to focus actually on one of the institutions, which is the media. So I want to fit in now and being grumpy. When I left Australia for graduate school 25, probably 30, a while ago, I used to love reading the Herald. I thought it was the best newspaper in the world. Then I returned 25 years later. It was the same people writing the same columns, and nothing changed. It has become a stale institution. And so when you talk about the importance of leadership, there's the politician here, and there's the audience here, and the lens in between is the media. And our media has become extraordinarily concentrated, and I think stale, and I think underfunded. There's all sorts of problems with the business models outside the ABC. Now let's turn on the switch of optimism. There's this bloke I know, used to be Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, started a YouTube channel just from his house. And he talks to people and he tells their stories. And he doesn't need Fairfax and he doesn't need Murdoch. And he can go straight through and he can tell stories in new and different authentic ways. So maybe these questions of leadership could be solved if the Australian media industry is about to, and I'm sure it is, about to undergo an enormous transformation. Now, look, that transformation's immensely uncertain, right? Because we're going to move from Fairfax to Anderson. So you good bloke? Oh, I hope so. What are guys like him going to do with their platforms? I don't know. So I guess there's an optimistic story and a pessimistic story. I know you, John, and I know that you'll use your platform to advocate for leadership and to give leaders a place to stand up. And so if our existing institution is failing, it's probably good news that economically it's failing, and we've got a new way forward.
Justin, do you think one of the reasons that the people on this panel might be talking about the need for vigilance, the need for caution, the need to preserve what we've got is because we're looking exactly at the country in which you now reside?
Yeah, no, look, mate, the joke about antidepressants was real.
No, but it's true.
I
Complacency.
have dinner around the dinner table with a fellow economist, and every day we look at the news and we look at each other and we say, is it time to go? And my partner is so relieved that we have a second set of passports. So, look, I like to look on the sunny side because I've spent too much time with Americans.
But we're worried because of
there's a
what's
lot
happening
to
in
worry
America.
about. Now,
And we've made a big strategic bet on America.
Yeah, this is what we need to talk about as well.
Yeah.
If you've
Go
finished
there.
your point, yes. Because James, you know, you've written and thought a lot about our position globally, geopolitically, and have looked at the fact that really, and especially this was the case in the last election, not enough of our political class really confronting the question of what do we do if America is, say, hypothetically run by someone who's volatile or unpredictable or might not necessarily honour the alliance in the way in which we might hope. Can you explain what you think we should do and why? Because this matters to us as a democracy.
I think we've got to get better, and I think this process of renegotiation has already started under the Albanese government, but I think we've got to get better at working out when we need to align with the United States and when we don't. I think for the past 25 years, we've really put all the bets, the strategic bets, on the United States. We told ourselves that, you know, we could fold, if I can put it this way, we could fold the slouch hat into the nation's strategic doctrine, and that we would have this mateship forever. And then this bloke turns up in the White House. He doesn't give a fig about Australia. Trump is interested in great power relations. And he is not going to be thinking about Australia, probably not even Korea or Japan, when he does a deal with China. So we have to invest a huge amount of more activity and diplomatic effort into, firstly, peace. That should be our overriding purpose, to preserve peace in this region, because any war in East Asia over Taiwan or the South China Sea will be catastrophic, not only to those places but to the entire East Asian hemisphere in terms of the economy. Strengthening the sinews of multilateralism, deepening our relations with Indonesia, however hard that might be, making sure that Japan and Korea are also locked into these multilateral forums. And we've got to renegotiate the relationship with China, and that's already happening as well. I mean, what happens, for example, when perhaps over the next 20 to 30 years, the budget bottom line is not getting the big sugar hit that it gets from iron ore? Now, it might not necessarily come down rapidly, but we've got to think about what it is we are going to give China in terms of other services, for example. But, you know, still we have, this gets back to Justin's point about the media. I mean, this foolish and futile sort of fretting that goes on about should Albanese rush to Washington after Trump's elected? When's he going to meet him? Who did Miles meet or who didn't he meet? You know, what will they say about AUKUS? There's no incentive for this administration in Washington to do anything about AUKUS while we're pumping all this money out of the Australian Treasury into the American industrial base. But yeah, we have to sort of articulate, I think, more of a sense of being self-reliant both within and sometimes without the American alliance. That's hard for the political class to do because they have been suckled for so long and their mental maps are so sort of cradled in this visceral craving for the alliance that wrenching them from it, I think, is going to be very difficult indeed. But that's the mental adjustment that needs to take place.
But if I may, if we're going to wrench ourselves away from it and stand on our own 2 feet and be taken credibly, don't we have to take our own security and defence a little more seriously in this country?
Sure. I mean, and the big question underneath all of this is what is the alternative to the American alliance? And that's when you generally come up against a pretty sort of confronting brick wall, right? This is why, I mean, I don't think it's going to come from India, but this is why we need to do a lot more with Indonesia. I'm being realistic about this. We do need to spend more on defence, but that means there needs to be another difficult conversation that the political class have to have with the people. You've got to give up some of this: education, health, infrastructure. Right? I mean, there's just not some honeypot that we can keep drawing from the whole time. These are the sort of conversations we need to be having, I think. But, you know, strengthened multilateralism, locking China into its multilateral rhetoric, making sure that when we do so, we get conditions out of China that the sort of economic coercion that they put on Australia is a no-go zone. These are the sorts of things I think we've got to be thinking about. But you know, we seem to be drifting in this sea of, you know, sort of hoping for strategic equilibrium in the region, gritting our teeth and hoping that, you know, in 4 years' time, some liberal internationalist president will ride down Pennsylvania Avenue and the rules-based order will be re-established. This is structural change in the United States. It's structural, and the sooner we start to sort of adjust our thinking as to what that means, you know, in 75 years' time, will the Americans still be primarily engaged in Asia in the way they are now? I doubt it. So what does that world look like, you know?
Yeah, I want to bring in a different time metric, if I could, by ending with Larissa. Now, Larissa, you make the argument that when we talk about democracy, we very often go back to ancient Greece or revolutionary Europe, all of which have very positive and important things to contribute to our understanding of government. But what are other ways, other wisdoms that we could use to energise our democracy?
Well, I want to start by being optimistic in a way and back the trend without diminishing any of the serious issues that anyone on the panel has said, because we've all thought deeply about this and I think we've identified them. We talked a little while ago about the referendum, which was devastating for First Nations people. Whether they were for it or against it, it was a difficult time because of the narratives that were around it. And I was really impressed by how many Aboriginal leaders around the country immediately just dusted themselves off and looked at actually the fact that this was a referendum on the Constitution, not a referendum on Indigenous people, and looked at the polling that says 80% of Australians, this is Reconciliation Australia does these surveys, it's always around 80 to 86% of Australians think that the relationship with Aboriginal people is important. And we might disagree on what that relationship looks like, but that is a strong support for inclusivity. And so maybe that's why one of my favourite elders, Peter Yu, very wise man, says we have to be optimistic because the alternative is unthinkable. As I say in my lecture, I think there are lots of strong things that we get from the tradition of democracy. And in fact, we don't even utilise a lot of them. Think about how the Greeks used things like citizen assemblies to really engage the broader population in the idea of democracy. We also, I actually agree with John Anderson about the fact that we don't teach civics like we should. So we're not engaging young people in the political system the way that we should. I've been very lucky in that I've been educated in the Western system and I've trained as a lawyer and I work in that system, but I also grew up with an Aboriginal heritage where I was taught the values of that system. It is surprising to me that while we so often say one of the things about Australia we should be really proud of is that it is home to one of the world's oldest living cultures. But there is a lack of curiosity about how that occurs. Now, of course, that sustainability was about working with the environment, but was also about governance structures. You don't get to be the world's oldest living culture just because you know how to live with the land. It's because you know how to live with people. And one of the values that comes through this system of governance is about reciprocity, and it's also about interconnectedness. Our totemic systems, the way we see the world, connect us to country, They connect us to each other, they connect us to our ancestors, so we respect where we've come from, and they connect us to our descendants, so we have to think deeply about what the legacy is of our actions. Imagine if we could have a conversation about what's unique about Australian democracy that starts to think about this idea of interconnectedness. It breaks away from this idea of individualism, and if you get this, then I don't get that. This us and them mentality that actually makes it really difficult to get the kind of law reforms that we need to make society fairer. That us and them mentality that will become even more entrenched as we see greater discrepancies between rich and poor, people who are on one side of technology and people who are on the other. And that might sound Pollyanna-ish, but I will say this. One of the things that has been a perennial problem for Aboriginal communities is having been so devastated by the impacts of colonisation, having to deal with the issues of how we become included in the broader community, we have had to think about how we rebuild our governance systems. Aboriginal nations like the Gunditj Mara in Victoria and the Ngarrindjeri in South Australia have rebuilt governance systems that are inclusive and reflect their values so that they have an interface with government. And I think one of the things that is really noticeable about that is you talk to communities who've been devastated. Remember, the Ngarrindjeri were the group that had the Hindmarsh Island Bridge case, which devastated them. Gunditj Mara are from Victoria, where the Yorta Yorta decision basically took away their hopes for native title. But rather than sitting around and worrying about that, they got on and built these governance structures that replicated a way to make decisions so that decisions weren't made for them. And the point I want to make is, as I've watched those communities build those governance structures, what struck me is as people who were disengaged, were marginalised, were voiceless, became involved with these local processes of governance and inclusion where they had a voice. They might not always get their way, but there was a community structure where they could be heard. It not only transformed those communities, it transformed the people who were participating in them. So I think there are lessons to be learnt, not just from the wisdom of those cultures, but the way in which we've resisted and rebuilt community governance structures which are about inclusion and which are about giving people voice.
I absolutely love that idea of bringing the idea of, bringing the sense of connection and interdependence back as a central idea of democracy, which ties back to Justin's point on inclusion. So thank you. We're going to have to end it there, unfortunately. It's been absolutely fascinating. The idea of optimism containing also vigilance, a need for leadership, a need to combat complacency and to be visionary and remember who we are has been a really wonderful discussion. I want to thank our 5 lecturers, Justin Wolfers, John Anderson, Larissa Berendt, Amelia Lester and James Curran for such a thought-provoking discussion. Now, do remember, if you want to catch up with any of these lectures or watch the series in full, you can find them all on ABC iView. And that's all from this special edition of the 2025 Boyer Lectures. I'm Julia Baird. Thanks so much for joining us.